All right, we're back with these kind of funny sentences. So what do they mean? So we need more intelligent leaders. It can mean one of two different things, right? It could mean that there are intelligent leaders out there, and then we just happen to need more of them. Or it may mean that there are leaders, but we want the ones that are more intelligent rather than the ones that are less intelligent, right? Slightly different meanings in those particular cases. I like green eggs and ham is interesting because what's green here exactly? Is it just the eggs, or are both the eggs and the ham green? I like green eggs and ham. The third one is the police shot the terrorists with rifles. So who has the rifles in this particular case? Is it the police who are doing the shooting? That's kind of what you're probably biased to think, but maybe the terrorists have the rifles and the police are shooting the terrorists with handguns or something like that. So it's ambiguous when you stop and think about it, what exactly these things mean. So these are examples of what are called structural ambiguity, where you have the same string of words with more than one interpretation. That means we can boil it down. There should be more than one different kind of phrase structure in the sentence. So in syntax, we put words together into units that are smaller than sentences, that are called phrases, and those phrases get put together into a higher level of structure called a sentence at the top. We're actually going to call it a specific kind of phrase when we get to that point, but you can think of it that way to begin with. So sentences break down into phrases, phrases break down into individual words, and if you shift how the words get put together into those particular phrases, even if they're in the same order, they can wind up leading to different interpretations, like we need more intelligent leaders. Here's some other, hopefully, amusing examples that I picked up or somewhere along the line. They're supposed to be newspaper headlines from wherever. We'll just read through them for fun. So yeah, one way in which syntax can enrich your life is through unintentional humor, along with a variety of other ways. But number one, hospitals sued by 7-foot doctors. Or is it hospital sued by 7-foot doctors? Lawyers give poor free legal advice. Enraged cow injures farmer with axe. Complaints about NHL referees growing ugly. Yeah, Don Koharski. Crowds rush to see Pope trample man to death. No offense, Mr. Koharski, if you're out there. I love hockey. French offer terrorist reward. Okay, so on and so forth. What are these people doing? They're engaging in ambiguity. This happens with newspapers because they kind of have to condense thoughts into a small amount of space. At least that's the way it used to be when they actually printed newspapers. Okay, so you can get some funniness out of that. But for our purposes, we have to worry about how we actually represent these different interpretations in syntax. So method number one, which is not really the way we're going to do it, but other people will, so I want you to be aware of it. But one way you can sort of represent phrase structure in a sentence, or at least a string of words, is by putting words in brackets. So for more intelligent leaders, do we want intelligent leaders but just more of them, or do we want leaders, we just want the more intelligent ones? So if I put more intelligent in brackets, that means these two words are more closely related to each other. So if I have this structure, I want the leaders that are more intelligent. And if I have this structure, intelligent leaders are more closely related to one another. So I want the intelligent leaders, I just want more of them. This is a lot like morphological bracketing, which again we didn't really use, but if you remember this ambiguous word, unlockable, either something was unlockable or maybe it was unlockable. You could put the various morphemes in brackets like this to represent whether they were related more closely to one another or not. Instead, we're going to use phrase structure trees, and we'll fill in kind of some gaps here as we go along. But if I write it out this way, like more intelligent, leading up to a node lower in the hierarchy of the phrase structure tree, that means that these two kind of combine together first, and then afterwards they add on leaders. So if I do it with intelligent leaders first, that means that these two have a closer relationship and they add on the more afterwards. So this is where we have intelligent leaders in the world and we just want more of them. But you can see the ambiguity pretty nice and easily here just by looking at the phrase structure itself rather than looking at the words on the surface. Just so you know, as we go, so each one of these places where these lines link up in the phrase structure tree, that is called a node. And these are called the constituents of a particular phrase. And we also have a root node sort of at the very top. It's a little bit different from root as we thought about it in morphology. And then sometimes you also will hear syntacticians talk about like mother nodes and daughter nodes, sort of where mothers are higher up in the hierarchy than the daughter nodes are. But you can use these terms as you wish as we go through this, and I will probably use them myself. Okay, so in morphology, if you go back to our unit a month or two ago, each node in a tree had to be a real word. So we had this example of unlockable. This is unlockable. So in this case, when we're adding lock together with a bowl, we get lockable, and that had to be a word by itself. So this starts off as a verb, becomes an adjective when you talk about things being lockable. At least you have a word here, and then you can add the un to make a new word here at a higher level in the hierarchy. And we had two different structures for this, but each step along the way produces a real word. What we're going to see in syntax is that each node above the word level represents a phrase. So a phrase is a string of words that functions together as a unit syntactically. And they come in different flavors or types. So these correspond to the lexical categories we've been talking about, primarily for, some lexical categories lead to these phrase types, some don't. Sort of the main lexical categories that we normally think about are the ones that sort of project up higher to specific phrase types. So a noun phrase, which will be abbreviated NP, is something like an intelligent leaders, right? So there's a noun in here, which is forming the head of the phrase. You can also have verb phrases like shoot terrace, which describe an action. This describes like a person, place, or thing, but it functions like an individual noun in a sentence. This functions like an individual verb, shoot terrace. A prepositional phrase has normally a preposition followed by a noun, like with rifles. Adjective phrases will have an adjective in there that is modifying something, so more intelligent would function like an individual adjective, like intelligent or unintelligent. Okay, so every phrase has to have at least one constituent. The constituent is called the head of the phrase, and it determines the phrase's function, behavior, and category. So the easiest way to think about it is kind of the way I was talking about it before. If you have like a noun phrase, it can function the same way an individual noun would in that particular case. So a noun phrase is always going to have a noun in it, and it will behave like a noun. A verb phrase will always have a verb in it, and it will behave like a verb does. So a noun phrase, to give you a variety of examples, a really simple noun phrase would be an individual noun like Bob or book. But then you can add other things to it to kind of start to expand on it. So you can add a determiner at the beginning of a noun phrase and say the book or that book or a book. You can even start to add noun phrases within noun phrases. So a picture of Bob, the head of that noun phrase is this noun, and then there's another noun phrase in here, which is Bob, headed by Bob. But this is where we start to get, say, these patterns of patterns. A picture of Bob is a noun phrase. A picture of the unicorn is a noun phrase. That weird picture of Bob's unicorn is a noun phrase as well. You can keep going and going and going. Hopefully you see how that's possible just by embedding noun phrases and noun phrases here. I'm not going to do that, but that's how you get recursion, or these patterns of patterns to generate infinitely long thoughts and infinitely long sentences in languages. Okay, so the main point of this, though, before I get too far off topic, is that each phrase is going to have a head, and I've highlighted or bolded the head of the phrase in each particular case here. These are nouns heading a noun phrase. Okay, so there's a pattern. It's pretty straightforward. Noun phrases are headed by nouns, and we can say an NP, a noun phrase, may consist of an individual noun. A verb phrase is going to be headed by a verb, so a verb phrase may consist of an individual verb. Prepositional phrases headed by prepositions. Adjective phrases headed by adjectives. I'm going to change this actually before I post these and just say AP. In theory, you could have an adverb phrase, but we don't see them very often, and I'll just say AP denotes an adjective phrase because that's how we'll see it in the trees we draw. But there's a basic phrase structure rule that any general phrase, an X phrase, is going to be headed by whatever that X is. So NP headed by N, VP headed by V, so on and so forth. Hopefully this is not too hard to wrap your head around. Okay, beyond the heads, phrases can be expanded with specifiers and complements. And roughly speaking, just specifiers are stuff that come before the head in a phrase, and complements are things that come after the head in a phrase. In addition to that, specifiers, if you think about it semantically, specifiers are going to specify some information about that head. So they qualify or pick out a particular version of the head, like, say, this book. Normally what you'd see for noun phrases is that their specifiers are going to be determiners. So it's this book, or maybe it's that book. It's a book, or it's some book, so on and so forth. For an adjective phrase, what you get are what are called degree words, like very. The textbook uses the term qualifier for specifiers of verb phrases, like an often forgets. I often forget that these are called not called adverbs in the textbook, so forgive me if I happen to do that as I'm walking through these lecture notes. You can maybe often forget and often forgive along with it. And say a prepositional phrase headed by, say, a preposition like in might be modified or specified by the degree word almost. So these things coming before the head of the phrase are kind of specifying a particular type of that particular head, and giving you more information about it that way. On the other side, you have complements that follow the head of the phrase, and they provide more information about the head. I'll say more about this, but normally complements are considered to be a little more tightly bound to the head of the phrase, because in some cases the head needs to have that complement after it. So this book about unicorns, here's a determiner, here's a noun, here's an entire prepositional phrase kind of embedded within this whole noun phrase, this book about unicorns. So this is a complement, so-called, of this particular noun phrase. We talk about very late to class. This is another prepositional phrase embedded in an adjective phrase headed by late. Again, each one of these is following after the head of the phrase. Often forgets his hat. This is a noun phrase complement of a VP headed by forget or forgets. Almost in the basket. Normally a preposition is going to have a noun phrase complement after it. So in is the head here, and the noun phrase, and P is within that prepositional phrase functioning as the complement of it. So you can see this is already starting to get tricky, but this is how syntax can be kind of amazingly productive and creative for us, is that we get phrases within phrases pretty quickly, and we need to figure out how to embed them to build up to an entire sentence at sort of the top of the structure. So with that in mind, the way the book walks you through this structure is that heads, complements, and specifiers fit together in a phrase in a very specific way. So like I said, heads and their complements form a slightly tighter form of structure called the Xbar. And the way that it's drawn out for any given type of phrase is like this. So I have some type of phrase XP that's headed by something that has a lexical category X. That is the head. That is the one thing that you need to have in the phrase. The stuff in the phrase that comes before the head is called the specifier. The stuff that comes after is called the complement. The complement and the head are a little more tightly bound to each other, so they form a sort of subunit, which we're going to label as Xbar. And then that combines with the specifier to form a larger unit called XP. So let's say, for instance, we'll walk through a couple of examples, but say I had a noun phrase that I was working around with here. This level would be NP. This would be N bar, basically N apostrophe. And then this label would be N for the head just by itself at the bottom. I'm going to walk you through in the next video some examples of how to test whether words are functioning together as a unit in syntax. And once we walk through that, it might be a little bit easier to understand why we get this sort of Xbar level of structure here, as well as this one too. But I think I'm going to pause for now. But I'm going to add before I do that the heads are the only thing you really have to have in here. So the simplest level of phrase structure would be XP going to Xbar going to X to the head without either the specifier or complement. That's why I put these things in brackets or parentheses here. You don't have to have them, but sometimes they fit in nicely. I'm going to pause there for a second, and we'll talk about phrase structure tests and examples in the next video.